Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, a little late on this one, but I'm talking about the new album from Machinedrum, A View of You. Machinedrum, aka Travis Stewart, is a producer from North Carolina and a name that's kept popping up on my radar and I've been curious about for a while. Brian from Not Real Music already reviewed this album back when it came out in mid-October. I got a $10 Patreon request from an artist who marked Machinedrum as one of his biggest inspirations. Then I saw Machinedrum himself take over the Discogs Twitter to talk about his memories of Boards of Canada's Music Has the Right to Children. Even Fantano stuck this in a Why You Know review, and I saw he'd actually reviewed 2 of his old albums when they came out. And I'd probably seen quite a few, actual requests to talk about him in my comments, though I can't remember. Whatever the case, he'd piqued my interest as an artist that I should probably be checking out more in depth. And here we are. I'm now reviewing his most recent album as a catch-up attempt, you know. So this guy, I guess he's currently on Ninja Tune. He was on the label Merc and put out one project on Planet Mu as well. He's been at it since like the really early 2000s. He's pretty well established. Supposedly his stuff falls under such umbrellas as glitch hop, drum and bass, jungle, juke, footwork, maybe a bit of dubstep or IDM depending on the release. I went through all his previous studio albums, and here's my thoughts on his discography so far. Okay, so this is kind of like if Boards of Canada had even more obviously pronounced hip-hop influences than they already did. You got these moody synth soundscapes going over breakbeats, pretty clearly inspired by those guys, and a few moments borderline ripping them off, see the closer especially. But there's also lots of chopped up shouting and rapping vocal snippets placed all over. It's notably more energetic, banging, and glitch heavy on average than actual BOC. Pretty promising start, though still got some growing to do. Okay, so much for growth. This is pretty much just a complete ripoff of Music Has the Right to Children. He can do BOC's style consistently well enough that I won't complain too hard, could theoretically even mistake this for the guys themselves, but yeah, definitely not getting any points for originality here. This one's focusing a lot more on those glitchy sample manipulations that were more of his own thing, while still mostly focusing on the same kinds of chill vibes his last 2 albums created. Pretty decent stuff, if maybe running on a little too long for its own good, and not the most memorable stuff overall, though I do quite like the bits of jazzy flares occasionally. And now we're going in a more polished and commercial direction. The sounds are a lot cleaner, the grooves are a little funkier, there's a bunch of vocal guests too, mostly rappers, though a lot of those glitchy, chill IDM vibes from his last album still carrying over into this as well. Could still stand some cutting down, and definitely not the most attention-grabbing stuff I've ever heard. But yeah, I might have been actually a little more into this than the last 3, I don't know. Okay, this is the Planet Mu one, and oh wow, this is a big step up from his previous stuff. He's now implementing like some burial-style vocal chopping and rusty-style future bass or something, and combining that with some of those more polished synth flares and breakbeats as seen on his last album, and it turns out to all be a really good fit. Strange and abstract stuff that's still really easy to get into. This guy's finally got my attention now. This was really freaking good. Ah, there's the drum and bass stuff. I was wondering when that was gonna show up. Yeah, this takes a lot of the same territory he was exploring on his last album and adds some good old drum and bass beats to the mix, tons of atmospheric bangers and heavy ambience all around. Has a similar general vibe to Burial's Untrue, to the point where I forgot that this guy was not British. Though it's definitely made up of like different enough ingredients to pretty easily stand on its own. Man, 2013 really was a freaking incredible year for electronic music. This was great, I'm hanging on to this. And while the last album was all dark and gritty, this is the exact opposite. His brightest, poppiest, most overly polished and saccharine album to date, with a lot more influence from like Rusty's Glass Swords and probably like the poppier side of Sophie and the whole PC music crowd as well. It is perhaps unfortunately not on the same level as his last 2, mainly because I find a lot of the super pitched up vocal snippets, especially on some of like the earlier tracks, to get on my nerves. Also, unlike his last 2, I did not feel like this one fully escaped the shadow of its influences. But it is a still pretty solid and enjoyable effort all the same. And still much better than Rusty's other 2 albums. Which brings us to here. So yeah, I don't think Machinedrum is the kind of artist who like has a signature style that I can recognize from a distance. but I can appreciate that he's definitely never made the same album twice. Steadily progressing his sound over the years and really hitting on some intriguing stuff by the time we got into the early 2010s. Rooms and Vapor City are keepers for sure, if nothing else. And I wouldn't say he's had any projects that would like fall below the higher 6 range. I got some enjoyment out of every single one of these. Now, given how fundamentally different from each other all of these albums have been, I had no idea what to expect going into this new one. I saw it had a pretty stacked list of featured guests. An album that has Freddie Gibbs, Jesse Boykins, Subfocus, and Chrome Sparks would have to at least be interesting, if probably not very cohesive. And the more repetitive than it looks title seemed to be a callback to 1212, which, not one of his more memorable efforts, not sure what that would entail, but I just jumped in anyway, so what did we get with A View of You? Well, as I predicted, the 11 tracks on this album do not come together as a complete whole very well. It does sort of have the feeling of like a sort of a thrown together compilation with every track attempting to go for something different and no two adjacent ones having a similar vibe. I guess it does all have the same sense of polish to it that his 1212 album did, albeit not nearly as long-winded. But lack of focus aside, I did still really like basically every track on this thing. All of them individually clearly had a lot of love and care put into them, and there's no filler cuts or outright duds. It's even paced pretty dang well, and is certainly never boring. An album like Human Energy may have had more focus and cohesion and a clear direction, where this really didn't. But I definitely got more personal enjoyment out of this, easily. I can't say it quite hits greatness for me as a whole. There are definitely some tracks that do more for me than others, and plenty of issues I have all over the place. But I did in fact have a lot of fun with this across the board. I'd still probably rank it in the top half of his discography. May as well just go into individual tracks then. The Relic is our opener. Wasn't huge on this one on first listen, but it pretty quickly grew to become one of my favorites. Rochelle Jordan's reserved performance going over all these plucky synths and those giant skittering bassy stabs in the drop sections, and later some actual string sections when those come in. Oh my god, it's a freaking awesome moment there. While that drop may have been kind of off-putting at first, this is definitely one of the best sounding tracks in the bunch. And then we switch over to some much more atmospheric vocal-driven stuff on Star with Monopoly and Tenrel. Very smooth R&B influenced stuff. The soulful guest performances going great over these lush mixes of synth melodies also sounds great, and this isn't even one of the big highlights on this thing. I had considered marking it as a least favorite at one point for not standing out that much. Deciding on a least favorite was pretty difficult on this album. It kept changing with every listen, and all the worst cuts here still definitely have stuff to enjoy. I'll tell you one that was never remotely in consideration for that spot, though. Kane Train with Freddie Gibbs. Holy shit, does that one go hard. Those giant horn stabs and piano loops and Freddie's typically energetic verses and flows, everything in this one sounds freaking incredible. This one just knocked it out of the park. And Wait For You with Jesse Boykins has kind of like a similar vibe to the stuff he was doing on Vapor City. Really fast-paced and well-textured atmospheric drum and bass cut. And Boykins' voice is treated much more like a burial-type vocal sample echoing out in the distance. That was another consistent highlight. Kinda wish he'd done more stuff like this, honestly. But then we also get stuff like Sleepy Pietro with Tigran Hamasyan. Sorry for butchered pronunciation as per usual. This one killed in a totally different way from everything else. You got all these jazzy piano performances plinking all over each other and going over these skittering beats and moody synth pads, creating this really freaking nice atmosphere. That one's also great. Not every track on here killed it in the same way as this run of 3 did, though. And the rest of the album maybe gets a little spottier from there. Spin Blocks with Father is a pretty nice R&B type cut with all these mystical flute loops and plucking synths that almost remind me of something like Vale Smith might do, albeit way more straightforward and mainstream friendly. But as good as the instrumental is, Father's vocals are pretty generic. He just kind of sounds like your everyday stereotypical moody R&B singer that charts on Billboard these days. Wouldn't have hurt to get someone that sounded a little more expressive or unique, I don't know. Idea 36 with Chrome Sparks, oh that one was good. That was a nice ambient down-tempo cut with lots of fuzzy synth melodies going over bell arpeggios and lots of other plucked textures. That one sounds really good all around. And then there's Believe in You, which, oh boy, I am so conflicted on this one. This one should be great and just doesn't quite get there. It's trying to be like this punchy and hard-hitting future-based type cut, maybe could end up something like Break Science would have done on their Grid of Souls album. I don't know. And it has almost all the ingredients to knock it out of the park like they would have. Especially that core sample hook is freaking great, but it just doesn't have enough punch. Doesn't bang hard enough. The drops with the stabby synth chords and glittering arpeggios do have some punch to them, but they really need a much stronger bass line to go the extra mile. Maybe give the percussion some more body as well. I don't know. As is, its build-ups get me really hyped, but the payoffs leave me weirdly underwhelmed. Still a good track, but pretty frustrating in how close it came to being one of the best while just missing the mark. 1000 Miles with Subfocus, meanwhile, was thankfully a much more satisfying and well-mixed cut here. Another atmospheric drum and bass cut with lots of smooth, filtered synth pads and pianos and some really nice female vocal hooks thrown in for good measure. There's even a nice little sidetrack into all these plucking acoustic guitars. All of it came together really well. Last properly great track on the album. The last two tracks are both good, but don't hit the same heights as the best moments on here. Inner Eye was solid, while I'm not huge on the drop with those horn blares attempting to act as a bass line, and again, not being as satisfying or punchy as they could be. All the various other textures going around it, like the vocal chops and the glockenspiels and other synths, do make up for the somewhat underwhelming drops. And then finally we close with You're Too Young, another track that I'm really conflicted on and keep switching between finding it a solid closer or thinking it didn't quite stick the landing. On one hand, this track definitely has the right tone you'd want out of an ending, all celebratory and sentimental and emotionally satisfying, and that harmonized vocal sample in the background has this, like, old-school, late 50s, not-quite Motown feel to it, like Disclosure's Where Angels Fear to Tread. And that section in the middle, where all the beats just melt into this cloud of noise, if the track had ended right at the end of that part, right before the 3-minute mark, that would have been fantastic. But instead, it just kind of picks up again, and then kind of fizzles out anticlimactically. Also, the weird filtering and sidechaining on the horn samples that run throughout this one kind of hits a weird note for me too, in a way that's kind of hard for me to put my finger on. Sometimes they work for me, but other times they just feel a little off and maybe out of place. More so the sidechaining and less the sample itself or the way it's chopped up. I don't know. Good ending. Probably could have been better though. But that's everything on A View of You. No outright bad tracks here, but it's definitely still a mixed bag where some tracks just hit way higher levels than others and still feels like there's some missed potential for it to be even better than it already is. It's not going to be a year-end list contender or anything. Maybe in a different year when we weren't already getting no shortage of properly great electronic music and maybe could have had a better chance. And maybe with a bit more finessing on some of those later tracks, it might have still had a better chance even in this year. But, you know, whatever the case, I am definitely glad I picked this up and sat with it. It may be flawed, it had the potential to hit the 8 range and just missed it, but it's still a very solid album with lots of great moments. Definitely worth giving a shot if you were curious. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.